Imagine commanding 52 tons of Soviet armor, a steel fortress mounting the most powerful gun on the battlefield. Now imagine that fortress turning against you. What happens when the turret above your head, designed to rotate and deliver death to your enemies, suddenly locks solid and refuses to move? When you're tilted on uneven ground, enemy tanks closing in, and you're cranking the traverse wheel with everything you've got but nothing happens. This is the nightmare that haunted KV-2 crews in 1941. The story begins not with triumph, but with desperation. In the frozen hell of the Winter War against Finland from 1939 to 1940, Soviet forces faced a problem that tanks alone couldn't solve. The Finnish Mannerheim Line was a defensive masterpiece of reinforced concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and fortifications designed to stop any assault cold. Soviet infantry attacks bled themselves white against these positions. Artillery could pound them for days without meaningful effect. Even the newest Soviet tanks, armed with 45mm and 76mm guns, couldn't crack the heaviest Finnish bunkers. The Red Army needed something bigger, something that could demolish fortifications with a single shot. And they needed it fast, because the war was turning into an international embarrassment as tiny Finland held off the Soviet giant week after week. Soviet engineers in Leningrad were already developing the KV series of heavy tanks, named after Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov. The KV-1 was a formidable machine with exceptional armor and a respectable 76mm gun, but military planners wanted more firepower. They demanded a tank capable of mounting a 152mm howitzer, the kind of gun normally found on heavy-towed artillery pieces. This weapon could fire high-explosive shells massive enough to obliterate bunkers, flatten buildings, and destroy any fortification the enemy could build. The challenge was fitting such an enormous gun onto a tank chassis. The obvious solution would have been a fixed casemate design, like the assault guns Germany would later perfect. But Soviet designers made a fateful decision. They wanted a fully rotating turret. And that decision would seal the fate of hundreds of tank crews. To house a 152mm howitzer and its recoil mechanism inside a rotating turret, the engineers had to build something unprecedented. The turret they designed was absolutely enormous, a massive steel box that towered above the chassis. The final design stood nearly 12 feet tall, making the KV-2 one of the tallest tanks ever fielded in World War II. That turret alone weighed approximately 12 tons, a staggering amount of weight concentrated high above the tank's center of gravity. From the moment the first prototypes underwent trials, problems emerged. The turret sat atop a turret ring borrowed from the KV-1 design, but that ring was never engineered to support such enormous weight positioned so high. The entire vehicle felt top-heavy and unstable. During testing, crews reported that the tank swayed alarmingly when traversing rough ground. And when they tried to rotate the turret while the tank was on uneven terrain, something terrifying happened. The turret jammed solid. The traverse mechanism was entirely manual, requiring the gunner to physically crank a handwheel to rotate the turret. On flat, level ground, this was already exhausting work because of the turret's immense weight. But when the tank tilted even a few degrees to one side, the weight distribution shifted catastrophically. Gravity pulled the turret downward toward the low side, binding the traverse mechanism completely. The gunner could crank until his arms gave out, but the turret wouldn't budge. Or worse, the turret would begin rotating on its own, slowly swinging downhill with nothing the crew could do to stop it. If it swung too far, the mechanical advantage needed to rotate it back was simply impossible to generate by hand. The crew would be stuck with their gun pointing in whatever direction gravity had chosen, unable to engage targets, unable to defend themselves. Soviet engineers documented these problems during field trials, but the Winter War was already underway, and the Red Army needed bunker-busting firepower immediately. Production was approved despite the known flaws. The technical specifications of the KV-2 looked impressive on paper, and in some ways the tank genuinely was a marvel of engineering. The 152mm M10 howitzer was a brutally powerful weapon. It fired a high-explosive shell weighing 51 kilograms, nearly twice the weight a man could comfortably carry. When that shell detonated, it produced a blast radius capable of obliterating reinforced bunkers, collapsing buildings, and destroying any tank it hit with a single shot. The armor protection was exceptional for 1940, with frontal plates up to 75 mm thick that could resist every anti-tank weapon the Germans fielded in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. The tank weighed 52 tons fully loaded and combat-ready. It required a crew of 6 men to operate, one more than the standard KV-1, because managing that enormous gun and its massive ammunition required extra hands. The driver sat in the hull front, responsible for navigating terrain that could get the entire crew killed if he chose poorly. The commander, gunner, loader, and 2 ammunition handlers worked in the cramped turret space, surrounded by high-explosive shells and the mechanical nightmare of the traverse system. But every advantage came with a crushing disadvantage. Those 51-kilogram shells were so heavy that loading them in combat was a brutal physical challenge. The crew had to manhandle each shell from the ready rack, lift it to the breech, and ram it home while the tank was potentially moving, definitely shaking from nearby explosions, and possibly tilted at an angle that made everything harder. The rate of fire was abysmal. Under ideal conditions, on a flat firing range with a fresh, well-trained crew, the KV-2 could manage perhaps 2 to 3 rounds per minute. In actual combat, with exhausted crews, under fire, on uneven ground, the rate of fire could drop to 1 round every minute or worse. The ammunition capacity was severely limited. The tank could only carry 36 rounds, a tiny amount for a vehicle expected to support infantry assaults or engage in sustained combat. Once those shells were expended, the KV-2 was effectively a pillbox that could drive around but couldn't fulfill its primary mission. And that turret, that massive, vulnerable turret, made the tank easy to spot from kilometers away. The KV-2 entered combat for the first time during the final weeks of the Winter War in early 1940. In that specific role, against static fortifications, with time to position carefully on level ground, the tank performed reasonably well. Soviet crews discovered that when they could get their howitzer into position and firing, it absolutely devastated Finnish bunkers. But they also discovered something terrifying. Any movement over rough terrain risked jamming the turret. Commanders quickly learned to scout routes carefully, avoiding slopes and ditches whenever possible. But war doesn't offer that luxury. The enemy doesn't position their fortifications on nice flat ground for your convenience. And that meant KV-2 crews were constantly gambling with their lives every time they moved. Then came June 22, 1941, and everything changed. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, began with devastating surprise and overwhelming force. The Germans expected to face Soviet armor they could handle, tanks they'd studied and learned to defeat. Instead, they encountered KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks that their standard anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate. German panzer crews fired 37mm and 50mm armor-piercing rounds that bounced harmlessly off the thick Soviet armor. Infantry anti-tank rifles were utterly useless. Even towed 50mm anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate the frontal armor at anything other than point-blank range. The psychological shock on German forces was real. Soldiers who had conquered Poland and France suddenly found themselves facing armor they couldn't destroy. But while the KV-1 proved to be a genuinely formidable opponent that German forces learned to respect and fear, the KV-2 was about to reveal its fatal flaws in the worst possible way. The problem was the nature of the combat. This wasn't static warfare against fortifications. This was mobile warfare over the rough, broken terrain of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Western Russia. Roads were poor, often just dirt tracks. The countryside was crisscrossed with ditches, streams, small hills, and forests. Battlefields were cratered by artillery, churned up by tanks and trucks, strewn with rubble from destroyed buildings. This was exactly the terrain where the KV-2's stability problems became lethal. And Soviet doctrine made it worse. Tank units were thrown into desperate counterattacks with minimal planning, ordered to advance immediately to stop German breakthroughs. KV-2 crews didn't have time to scout routes carefully or position on flat ground. They had to move fast, engage fast, and hope their turret didn't jam at the critical moment. For most of them, that hope was betrayed. The Battle of Rėziniai in Lithuania, fought from June 23 to June 27, 1941, produced some of the most harrowing KV-2 stories of the war. Soviet Mechanized Corps launched counterattacks against the German 6th Panzer Division, trying to halt the German advance toward Daugavpils. Multiple KV-2s were committed to these attacks, and German after-action reports documented their shock at encountering these massive tanks for the first time. But those same reports also noted something the Germans quickly learned to exploit. The KV-2s were incredibly vulnerable to terrain. One German panzer commander described watching a KV-2 move off a road to engage his tanks. The Soviet tank tilted as it crossed a drainage ditch. The turret, which had been traversing to track targets, suddenly stopped moving. The German commander recognized what had happened even though he didn't yet know the mechanical details. The turret was stuck. He ordered his tanks to maneuver, forcing the KV-2 to choose between moving to keep its gun on target, which meant crossing more uneven ground, or staying put and hoping to engage with a fixed turret. The Soviet crew chose to move. The tank tilted further as it tried to keep the Germans in front. The turret jammed completely, locked facing the wrong direction. German tanks circled to the flanks and rear, where the KV-2's armor was thinner. Within minutes, 50mm rounds were punching through the side armor. The crew tried to bail out, but climbing down from that tall turret while under machine gun fire was suicide. 3 crew members were cut down on the ladder. The others burned alive when an ammunition fire erupted inside. Another KV-2 crew at Razinyi found a good defensive position on relatively flat ground near a village crossroads. For hours, they fought brilliantly. Their 152mm howitzer obliterated German armored cars, destroyed a Panzer III with a single hit, and demolished a barn that Germans were using for cover. Their thick armor absorbed multiple hits without penetration. But war is fluid. The Germans called in artillery and forced the KV-2 to relocate. As the tank moved backward to take up a new position, reversing over rubble from a destroyed building, the hull tilted sharply. The massive turret swung violently to the downhill side. The gunner tried desperately to traverse it back, cranking the handwheel with all his strength, but it was no use. The turret was jammed facing almost 90 degrees away from the enemy. The commander screamed orders. The driver tried moving forward, then backward, trying to level the tank. Nothing worked. They were stuck with their gun pointing uselessly to the side while German tanks advanced from the front. The crew had seconds to make an impossible choice. Stay in the tank and fight with their machine guns, knowing they couldn't bring the main gun to bear. Or abandon the tank immediately and run. The commander ordered everyone out. The driver was first, climbing through his hatch and sprinting for the nearby tree line. He made it. The 2 ammunition handlers were next, scrambling down from the turret hatches. One was hit by machine gun fire on the ladder and fell to the ground, wounded but alive. The other reached cover. The commander and gunner tried to exit together. The commander made it 3 steps before rifle fire cut him down. The gunner never left the turret. A German tank destroyer had moved into position, and its 75mm gun fired a single round that penetrated the turret side. The gunner died instantly. The loader, wounded on the ground beside the tank, was captured. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp. That was one of the lucky stories. He survived. Most KV-2 crews didn't. The mechanical problems extended beyond just the turret jamming on slopes. The traverse mechanism itself was poorly designed and prone to catastrophic failure. The gears could strip under the turret's immense weight, especially if the gunner attempted to traverse quickly or if the tank was moving when he tried to rotate the turret. Soviet tank doctrine required tanks to stop before firing to ensure accuracy, but combat rarely followed doctrine. Crews under fire would instinctively try to traverse while the driver was still maneuvering, and the mechanism would fail. Once the gears stripped, the turret was completely immobilized. It couldn't be rotated at all, not even manually by the entire crew pushing together. The tank was effectively destroyed as a combat vehicle even though the armor was intact and the gun was functional. But maintenance crews in the field lacked the specialized tools and replacement parts needed to repair these failures. A KV-2 with a jammed turret was usually abandoned where it sat, either destroyed by its own crew to prevent capture or simply left behind as Soviet forces retreated under relentless German pressure. There were other nightmares beyond the jammed turret. The sheer height of the vehicle made it fatally easy to spot. German observers could identify KV-2s from kilometers away, that distinctive tall turret silhouette unmistakable on the horizon. This negated one of the primary advantages of armored warfare, the ability to use terrain and concealment to achieve surprise. KV-2s were always spotted first, always identified as priority targets. German commanders quickly briefed their anti-tank gun crews to prioritize the tall tanks above all other targets. The height also made the KV-2 vulnerable to threats from above. Artillery shells that detonated overhead would rain shrapnel down on the thin roof armor, only about 10 mm thick. German Stukas and other ground attack aircraft could strafe the turret roof with cannon fire that punched straight through. And in urban combat, Soviet infantry defending buildings could fire down at the KV-2 from upper floors, targeting that vulnerable roof with anti-tank rifles and grenades. The traverse speed, even when the mechanism was working properly, was painfully slow. Rotating the turret 360 degrees took over a minute of continuous cranking by the gunner. In combat, when targets appeared suddenly from unexpected directions, that delay was fatal. If a KV-2 was ambushed from the flank or rear, which German forces learned to do routinely by mid-1941, the crew often didn't have time to bring their gun to bear before enemy fire found the thinner side and rear armor. German tank commanders developed specific tactics for engaging KV-2s. They would use one tank to attract the KV-2's attention from the front, forcing the turret to traverse toward that threat. Meanwhile, other German tanks would maneuver to the flanks and attack the sides, where 75 mm and even 50 mm guns could penetrate at close range. Soviet crews knew they were being flanked. They could hear the enemy tanks maneuvering. But turning that massive turret fast enough to respond was impossible. They could only watch helplessly as German panzers positioned themselves for killing shots. The psychological toll on KV-2 crews was devastating in ways that went beyond physical danger. Every tanker understands that combat is dangerous. They accept the risk of enemy fire, mine strikes, mechanical breakdowns. But they trust that their vehicle will perform as designed when they need it most. The KV-2 betrayed that trust constantly and unpredictably. A crew might complete 5 missions without problems, then on the 6th mission, crossing a gentle slope they'd driven over a dozen times before, the turret would jam and trap them. There was no way to predict when it would happen. The uncertainty ate at crews' minds. Veterans of other tank types reported that KV-2 crews were noticeably different. They were more anxious before missions, more hesitant to maneuver aggressively, quicker to abandon their vehicles when threatened. This wasn't cowardice. This was rational fear of a machine that might kill them faster than the enemy could. Soviet commanders noticed that volunteers for KV-2 crews became increasingly rare as word spread about the turret problems. Crews who survived the loss of their tank would request, sometimes beg, to be assigned to literally any other vehicle. T-34s, KV-1s, even older light tanks, anything but another KV-2. Commanders had to order men into those tanks, and morale suffered accordingly. By the summer of 1941, the pattern was undeniable. KV-2s were being lost at catastrophic rates compared to other Soviet armor. German intelligence reports noted that while KV-1s were consistently encountered and posed serious threats, KV-2 sightings dropped off rapidly after the first weeks of Barbarossa. This wasn't because the Germans had learned to destroy them, though they had. It was because so many were being abandoned due to mechanical failures. Soviet tank recovery units reported finding KV-2s abandoned intact, the crews having fled after turrets jammed or traverse mechanisms failed. Some tanks were found with damage from Soviet demolition charges, crews having sabotaged their own vehicles to prevent capture. Others were simply left behind during retreats, the mechanical problems making them impossible to recover. German forces captured several functional or repairable KV-2s in the opening months of Barbarossa. They tested them extensively, documenting the turret problems in detail. Some captured KV-2s were briefly used by German forces, but they quickly abandoned them after experiencing the same jamming problems Soviet crews had reported. One German test report dryly noted that the KV-2 was an interesting design marred by critical mechanical flaws that render it unsuitable for mobile warfare. The crews who fought in KV-2s during those desperate summer months of 1941 displayed extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances. They climbed into tanks they knew were mechanical disasters. They fought in vehicles that might betray them at any moment. And many of them died not because the enemy outfought them, but because their own tank trapped them when the turret jammed. Soviet records from this period are fragmentary at best, destroyed during the chaotic retreats or never properly compiled in the first place. But German records provide some insight into the human cost. After-action reports from German units frequently mentioned destroyed or captured KV-2s with entire crews found dead inside. Penetrating hits from anti-tank guns had killed some, but many showed signs of having tried to escape only to be cut down by machine gun fire as they climbed out. The tall turret meant crew members had to climb down a ladder on the exterior of the tank to reach the ground. In combat, under fire, this made them perfect targets silhouetted against the steel hull. German machine gunners learned to watch jammed KV-2s and wait for the crew to try to escape. It was target practice. Some crews died in fires. The massive 152mm shells were packed with high explosive, and the propellant charges burned fiercely when ignited. A penetrating hit that sparked an ammunition fire gave the crew perhaps 10 to 15 seconds to evacuate before the interior became an inferno. But evacuating a KV-2 took time. The driver had to climb out his hatch at the front. The turret crew had to navigate the cramped interior, climb through hatches, descend the ladder. In 10 seconds, maybe half the crew could escape. The rest burned. Soviet tankers coined a grim phrase for KV-2s, they called them coffins on tracks. Other crews died more slowly, from wounds sustained when shrapnel from penetrating rounds tore through the turret interior. The cramped space meant shrapnel had nowhere to go except through human bodies. Crew members wounded in the turret couldn't be treated effectively. There was no room for first aid, no way to evacuate them. They bled out in front of their comrades while the battle continued around them. The captured crews faced uncertain fates. German policy toward captured Soviet tankers was inconsistent in 1941. Some were treated as regular prisoners of war and sent to camps. Others, particularly those identified as Communist Party members or political officers, were executed on the spot under the infamous Commissar order. KV-2 crews, because they operated such a prestigious and powerful tank, were sometimes assumed to be elite party members and treated accordingly. Several German reports mention executing captured KV-2 crews without trial. Those who survived capture faced years in German prison camps, where conditions were brutal and mortality rates were horrific, especially in the first years of the war. Of the roughly 200,000 Soviet soldiers captured in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, fewer than half survived until 1945. KV-2 crew members captured in combat had no better odds. The true climax of the KV-2 story came not on a battlefield, but in a series of terse communiques between Soviet factories and military high command in late 1941. Production reports showed that KV-2s were being built at significant cost in resources and factory time. Combat reports showed those tanks were being lost at catastrophic rates within days or weeks of reaching the front. Tank commanders were submitting increasingly desperate requests for more reliable vehicles. Crew survivors were refusing reassignment to new KV-2s. Maintenance units reported the tanks were impossible to keep operational under field conditions. The mechanical problems weren't fixable with minor modifications. The entire concept of mounting such a massive turret on that chassis was fundamentally flawed. By late summer 1941, with German forces advancing rapidly and Soviet factories being evacuated eastward ahead of the invasion, resources became critically scarce. Every ton of steel, every hour of factory labor, every trained worker had to produce weapons that actually worked. The KV-2 didn't work. The decision came down from the State Defense Committee. Production of KV-2s was halted immediately. Factories were ordered to complete existing hulls as standard KV-1s with reliable turrets. No new KV-2s would be built. For the crews still operating the remaining KV-2s in late 1941 and into 1942, this decision meant nothing. They were already trapped in those tanks, ordered to fight until they were destroyed or until mechanical failure forced abandonment. And they did fight, with desperate courage, knowing every mission might be their last not because of enemy action but because their own vehicle would betray them. The last documented combat use of KV-2s was in early 1942. After that, the few survivors were withdrawn to training units, used as fixed pillboxes in defensive lines, or simply scrapped for parts. The tank that was supposed to break enemy fortifications had broken itself, and broken the men who crewed it. The human cost can never fully be calculated. Soviet records from 1941 are incomplete, many destroyed during the retreats, others never properly kept as the military bureaucracy collapsed under the pressure of invasion. We know approximately 334 KV-2s were built before production ended. We know the vast majority were lost within the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. With 6-man crews, that's potentially over 2,000 men who crewed these tanks. Casualty rates for KV-2 crews were significantly higher than for other Soviet armor operating in the same battles. Many died in their jammed turrets, unable to fight back, unable to escape. Others died trying to abandon their vehicles, cut down by enemy fire. Some were captured and died in prison camps. The families received standard death notifications with no mention of the mechanical failure that sealed their loved ones' fates. The design flaws were classified, buried in military reports, never publicly acknowledged. The KV-2's legacy is one of wasted courage and preventable death. The KV-2 taught a brutal lesson: firepower means nothing without reliability. Those crews fought with courage that deserved far better than the machine they were given. The tank that betrayed at high speed stands as a monument to ambition and tempered by reality, and to the men who paid the price.